was lunch? Good? I think it's pretty cool that a lot of you, even though we didn't have the food trucks here this year, went and found them. So I've heard about some good food. I'm excited to bring out our second panel for the conference. Great to have Amanda, Cameron, Rayna, and Andi back on stage. Again, we're going to skip for introductions. You've already heard from these incredible, talented designers and product leaders. And we're excited now to take the questions that you have asked and to have an exciting conversation with them this afternoon. We're going to start off with a question that I love, a little bit a hot topic, but you started it. And it was your comment about being anti-PRD. You see that one coming?
Maybe.
So what do you do to capture if you're not, and why you're building something and the scope of the MVP?
For software?
Yes, for software.
For software, for me, it tends to be more iterative. I like to capture an initial MVP scope for what you're trying to solve with your product. But for me, you can't actually define that necessarily to the detail that you need in a PRD. And you find a lot as you start to build it that those things change so rapidly that your PRD becomes really outdated really fast. Actually, when I was at CNN, there was one of my counterparts in product loved PRDs, and I hated them. And she would write these PRDs, and they were massive documents, and we were kind of in an agile waterfall kind of mixture of a development cycle. And she would constantly be changing that document, and I found you had some people in the organization that were 3 versions back, looking at the wrong requirements, and that just confused things further. So I like to keep it more agile. We tend to do all of our requirements at Vivint in Jira, which I've used elsewhere, and that's much easier to change those constantly shifting requirements.
Okay, so it's not so much that you're not documenting it, but you're suggesting a different format.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You need something that's a little more flexible.
What other solutions are teams using to document requirements, ones that maybe are a little more fluid? Anybody?
We too, when I was in product, I also hate PRDs. They were always out of date. And then the excuses were always like, well, when the new person starts, they need to know how to QA it or what the product does, and they never read them, so that was nonsense. But we too kind of document in Jira, and then for better or for worse, there's some form of like tribal knowledge and release notes that we do over email that kind of documents like what we're trying to accomplish with the release and what's going on. But
so documentation over email, that sounds
dangerous.
Messy.
Yeah, but that's what people read. Slack, I actually think, has been a good tool in terms of like capturing conversations historically, and how we made some decisions, but it's not product documentation in the old way. But
sure.
I also think that the fresh eyes that come in and say, why do we even do it this way? Those are really good questions. And if we can't come up with a good answer, even if we had written it down 2 years ago, like, that's okay, let's take a fresh look at this, and rather than worrying about what the document says, what should we be doing?
Cameron, how do you guys document requirements?
I have no idea.
We don't. You heard it here. Facebook does not document requirements.
Clearly you've been studying them thoroughly.
No, honestly, I have no idea. You don't believe me on this.
This is why you don't document. No one reads it.
Okay.
I will say...
Let's talk about something else then.
I'm going to save Cameron really quickly. So we do actually do something called a product brief. And that should be no more than 2 pages to give you an idea of why you need a solution, what the problem is, and what that solution might look like. But it's not anywhere near as detailed as your Jira tickets and your specs should be. It's just a way to get everybody unified on the problems you're trying to solve.
Let's talk about design systems. Cameron, someone asked, how does the Facebook events team ensure that changes to the design system are either coordinated or automated in terms of the corresponding developer documentation and code?
That's a great question. So I think there's a couple ways this happens. One is just organically. So as we introduce the variances that I talked about earlier today into our work, there generally is a tight relationship between our team and the FDS, the design system team, to be open about what we're exploring, especially if it deviates significantly from what we have already. And so part of it is simply our team taking the responsibility and I guess in some cases the privilege of reaching out to those team members. They're very open, very great to work with. So some of the onus is on us. But some of the onus lies on those stewards of the design system itself. So Shally and her team members and the other teams that work on those design systems to stay abreast of everything that's happening in the company. And that, as you can imagine, is incredibly challenging and difficult. Shally would have to speak to how they do that. But there's a very open culture inside, I just said culture, an open environment inside Facebook to publicly, well, within Facebook, share an enormous amount of information about what's going on in projects across the company. And through that, part of what you have to do really well at Facebook is read updates like crazy. I thought, coming in with, I guess at the time, 18 years experience, that I had mastered email and Slack and Basecamp and project updates and so on and so forth. And I had no idea the level of information that exists inside the company because of the massive amount of teams that we have.
How are those updates coming out?
So we use an internal version of Facebook called Workplace. It's accessible to the public. Okay. You could say that's our version of Slack. And so I would imagine Shally and her team members are on there frequently to see what's happening across the company.
Yeah, great. What about Vivint? Do you have a design system?
We do. I'm not as familiar with it as I should be.
Okay.
We have standards sort of similar to what Cameron outlined, although I think it's probably in the version 1 of the design protocols with all the folders in various places. I think it's still evolving for us because as our teams have changed, like I mentioned in the talk, we're trying to figure out how we work in an environment where we have a design discipline across teams that are working independent of each other around those business opportunities and consumer experiences. So trying to keep those cohesive is a challenge.
Let me add something to this quickly.
Sure.
One of the best ways that I think design system stewards can ensure that the library, the system itself, kind of self-manages the ecosystem is to make the components in the library incredibly attractive to use, meaning to go roll your own and to custom build something would be a bigger investment than just using what's in the library. And so there's some self-facilitating that happens when you make those components a very easy sell to use.
Yeah, okay. Let's take the challenge of coordinating with and communicating through a larger team and expand that beyond design systems. As teams continue to evolve and get larger, it's hard to know what's going on. We were talking about that at dinner the other night. And I'd be very interested to hear, Rayna, maybe let's start with you. What are some ways that you would recommend teams or things that you have done to help people to simply be aware of what's going on as a team gets larger and larger and larger?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it starts with having a really strong core. So I think whether that's a group of designers or a group of senior designers, if your team starts out large, or if you're growing the team from a smaller kind of nucleus of people, I think the important part there is to really get your systems and your type of understanding or communication style nailed out and solidified, and to develop your relationship as a team. Because I think that the danger in scaling is the communications and the relationships don't scale in the same way. So I think if you have a strong core of established practices, then that'll help you expand. I think research is a really good example. Sounds like a lot of folks are in, not to only talk about research, but it seems like folks are in similar boats where they know that it's something they want to develop and they want to grow it to scale. But it's important to figure out how to nail down the core and the foundations, and then you can grow from there.
how do you do that at Facebook? You know, you can't have a team going off rogue. You know, you've got to maintain a brand. You've got to maintain a certain experience. How do you have that many employees being able to understand and have simple visibility to what the other teams are working on?
To what the other teams are working on?
Yeah.
That's challenging. Really, a lot of it is self-guided. A lot of it is an investment in understanding what's happening amongst those other teams. One of the things I do as a manager for my team is to encourage outreach and to encourage what I like to call peacetime relationship building, where you might not have a need yet for that team or the product that they provide, but when you do, 6, 12 months down the road, sometimes that time period down the road is a little too late to start that relationship building. Whereas if you know that, okay, events, we want to partner better with Instagram, then it's a matter of me reaching out to a design manager over in Instagram, my team members reaching out to a PM or their counterparts in Instagram, even though we might not yet be doing a whole lot in terms of collaboration. But investing now so that when that time comes, it's a much easier door to open and to start that conversation.
Awesome.
I think the only thing I would add to that is, in an alternate universe, there's another version of this panel, which is all of our peers who are wondering what our teams are working on. And so I always challenge my team to think about what they're doing to share what they're working on. I think you have to lead by example. I think you have to role model. For some people, that starts with weekly updates or whatever your venue is for sharing. But I think every time I hear someone, generally on my team, complaining, I don't know what this PM's doing, this dev's doing, I say, well, what have you done to share what you're working on lately, and how do they even know that your work overlaps? And so I think I would just ask everybody here, if this is a problem in your organization, lead by example, stand up, share your roadmap, share what you're working on.
So I'm surprised, I've got to say, I'm not feeling much formal process. I'm hearing a lot of be proactive, build relationships. If you want to see it, make sure you're sharing it, reciprocate. Am I hearing you correctly that you don't have a lot of formal process to review and bring these teams together?
We do have a few processes that we do at Vivint, and some of it is to Amanda's point around being the example. So one of the things that I asked my team to do in the last few months is we do monthly demos now across the entire org, well, at least across the Innovation Center, with engineering and product partnering to show off what they've been working on and also talk about what's coming up in their roadmap. Because as we've moved into these vertical teams, we do find that we're more siloed and we don't understand what other teams in the org are doing. And that has helped a lot for us to communicate out. We do also have regular internal meetings, but they're primarily with leadership. And I do think we're feeling friction internally where the leadership knows what's going on with everybody, but not everybody understands what's going on with everybody. And that does leave a little bit of a gap, and we're still trying to work through that challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I would say from what I've seen in working with teams, it is a little bit of a layered approach. You have the quarterly meetings where there are demo days or there's something else where teams can really share progress and talk to one another about what it is they're building. Then on the manager level, you have weekly reviews with your teams where they can share or you can troubleshoot. And then you have one-on-ones, which is another layer below that. And maybe you have daily reviews as people need them. So I think maybe it's a little bit like maybe we haven't called out, but it's kind of like a layered cake approach where based on different time periods and different audience bodies, you can kind of set up that system. Because I think it's not just about having a big share out and then saying, we've shared it, it's done. It's about creating a system so that people can communicate with one another, and share.
That's great. I mean, we have a lot of what you just described as well in terms of weekly meetings and quarterly all hands and stuff of that nature. But I do think there's a difference, to your last point, between just being aware of what other people are working on and actually being proactive about collaborating with other people. Those take two different approaches, right? I can be aware of everything that's happening in the company, but for my team to collaborate with another team takes a lot more effort than just watching an all hands or something like that.
Okay, thank you. Rayna, this one's for you. This is a very specific question about creativity. The brain needs to be bored to come up with a creative solution. This statement really resonated with me. As a visual person and a designer, I need some free time to digest all the information before I can come up with a solution. Unfortunately, sometimes it's perceived as procrastination. Have you ever experienced that? And if so, what did you do to solve it?
You've never experienced that.
Never at all.
Never.
Well, I think something that I do a lot is I use a lot of, remember when we were talking about kinesthetic synthesis, and we were talking about making your thinking visible, putting your thinking on paper, making boards that organize your thinking, that demonstrate it. A lot of the times that actually helps me not only progress my thinking, but give the impression that I'm doing lots of work. And I'm like, it's just paper on a wall, but people are like, that's so much work. And I'm like, I'm just drawing stick figures on a wall. It's not a ton, but it gives, it's not really an illusion, I should say. It's a little bit more than that. It does give the impression that you're thinking through a volume of work. And there is a nice feedback cycle that happens. I would say I'm an input monster also, which means I have to absorb a lot of information for my brain to do the magic stuff. But I kind of have to push it out into the physical world somehow. Otherwise, it kind of gets stuck inside, and I think a lot of time that maybe could amount to procrastination is really just because you're cyclically thinking through similar things in your heads instead of putting it out on paper. Because what you do is when you write something on paper, you put it on a wall, your brain doesn't need to hold it anymore. It's done, it's out there in the world, you can see it, and then that's a physical thing that you can manipulate. So if you feel like that's type of pressure that you're dealing with, maybe those are some tools that you could use to just visualize your process to get people off your back. I think personally, I've dealt with a lot of time management things, and as you kind of get to know yourself as a creative, you can find the different tools that will push you along the way. I don't have it figured out yet, so it's not a tried and true. I don't have it baked in stone, but that's one approach you could take.
Thank you. I think a lot of times it probably comes down to managing expectations well,
Yes,
and
absolutely.
just status updates. That's something that I've thought a lot. People don't mind if it's going to take a little extra room if you simply request it and let them know how things are progressing. Silence is what makes things difficult inside of an organization.
Yeah, having a conversation about what you're thinking is talking about your work. You don't have to come in with a solution. You can come in with your questions. You can come in with what you're thinking. Yes. And then that can also count.
Absolutely. And I've actually been pushing my team a lot for that recently as well, of simply saying it doesn't need to be a deliverable. It's simply saying, here's where I'm at, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I'm working on. I love that. Thank you. Amanda, what should a product manager focus on when it comes to data associated with its product performance? Should he or she be only focusing on the what and leave the how with data analysts and engineers? What should product managers do to believe that the dashboard of the product is reflecting the truth?
Yeah, so we'll see if I get beat up by the product people for this one. Great product managers that I've worked with bring the questions of what they want to understand. So you're launching a feature, what do you need to know? What do you want to know? Are you reporting your revenue, your conversion, what are those metrics? But then also what are the secondary drivers and the double-click metrics? Is it a funnel? Is it, different behaviors? You guys can figure out what makes most sense for your product scenario. So I really look to the product managers to figure out what they want to understand, so the questions, and then the next part is I'm pragmatic about. I've been in organizations where the devs felt strongly about instrumenting everything because the product managers were inconsistent and they thought we were lazy. They're probably right. The PMs feel very strongly about their event structure and how they do it. The data team feels strongly. I'm really pragmatic about how that part gets done. I think that's up to your organization. But the biggest problem is that I've experienced is product managers either don't know what they want to know, or they change their mind 3 weeks later because they're like, oh, well, it actually wasn't built to do this. It was built to do that. And you're like, not really. But then the question about how do I trust the data on the dashboard is an interesting one, paraphrasing a little bit. I think I love when PMs, QA the product, right? If it's a feature, you will go out and try it and see if it works. You should be doing the same for your data. If you sign up, does it go from 0 to 1 on the dashboard? Is that what you're counting, or is that what you're tracking? You can automate a lot of the QA, but the spirit of what you're trying to measure really comes down to, as a product manager, understanding what your problems are that you're trying to evaluate.
Andi, I'd love your perspective, especially because you have the hardware mix in there. What should the product manager be focusing on in terms of tracking product performance?
Yeah, I like what you said, Amanda, about actually eating your own dog food and using your own products. I'm a big believer in, if you're tracking anything in your product, you better be making sure the tracking is working right. And sometimes things go out and they're not. And we needed to actually have them go out to find that. Hardware is a little bit harder in terms of tracking interaction. I mentioned the Smart Hub downcast LED. It doesn't have any actual interaction, so we can't quantify it in any way. We can't put any pixels on it. So it's in those instances where we really rely on getting into consumers' homes and understanding how they actually interact with the product, where we can actually understand the metrics behind it. Trying to think if there's anything else. One of the things that we do have, though, is, so our Smart Hub has that screen on it, and there are a lot of interactions in there, and we do actually have tracking in there to track the interactions that take place there. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell us a lot of the context around when things are used or what the trigger was to cause somebody to interact with it. And so we still have to use that research arm to really get in and understand exactly what's going on. It's limited. Tracking the way we think about it, especially in the software world, is really limited in an environment that is way bigger than just the screen that it's on. So we have to take lots of steps and lots of research to put that whole picture together.
Yeah, if I can jump in on that, I do think as product managers, as product people, we've gotten really lazy about what we look at as data. So, funnels are easy to create. We now have 1 million tools. Everybody's got immediate access to everything. That is part of the story. It's not the why, it's the what. And I'm always pushing product managers to, look through the CX logs, look through the call scripts, try to see where the most frequent tapped areas of the FAQ, whatever it is that you can look for, because I just find it's working because the conversion rate's 20%, but there's no context as to who it's working for, why it's working, and whether 20% is even the right number.
So I'm totally going to go off script here and just ask you a question off of that I've encountered recently and have heard a lot of people discussing. Is we're in an interesting realm now where before you'd go and do research and come back and hand it to the team, and that was it. So it was accepted as truth because nobody could, refute it. But today, because we have those tools, and in fact, a lot of companies have 4 different analytics solutions running at the same time.
Yep.
And so you bring the data, and you can almost find the data that you want to tell the story that you want. And you've got one team that's got one set of data, another team that has another, and they don't match. Have you encountered that?
I think that's how I got my job.
That's how you got your job. So what do you do?
So I think for particular metrics that really matter, and I would argue it's not at a feature level, it's probably at a product level or a channel level, you have to agree on what that definition is up front. How do we define it? How do we document it? What does it really mean? But I believe I can make the data at Hotel Tonight tell any story you want me to tell you.
Is there a time
just a part.
Is there a time that a single source of truth is better than the truth?
Oh, zinger.
But what is the
yeah.
truth?
Yeah, right.
What'd you say?
I said, but what is the truth?
Yeah. Does it
Meta.
Does it matter? Or as long as you're trending in a good direction?
I do think there's something to be said for consistency and confidence and preventing analysis paralysis. And even, I was joking with our controller the other day, I think one of the organizations I thought would be most rule-based in our company is accounting, right? There are rules about this, there's many of them, there are many pages on how to do these things, and even those guys are the most creative, and gals, are the most creative people in the organization. So I've lost all faith in reality. I can make the numbers say anything you want, but I do think consistently wrong reality is probably better than this perpetual spin of what is the truth?
I think a
What's
lot of
a
times
user?
I would agree.
I will say we have an interesting situation at Vivint, we didn't have data for a long time. We didn't track a lot of things. And now that we have data, sometimes when people's assumptions disagree with what the data says they question the data.
Yeah.
Because they were sure it worked this way or consumers used it this way, and then when you actually have the data, even if it's from multiple sources and maybe they don't totally agree, it still shows a different message than what people's assumptions are. And I think that is actually a bigger challenge than the actual data itself, is changing minds to have them actually understand what the data is saying and believe it.
It could,
oh, go ahead.
It could be a little bit of an idealistic view, but if we're talking about different data streams coming in and talking about conflicting outcomes, that seems like a perfect opportunity to talk about a research effort, right? That seems like the point at which you can say, okay, hold up. Everybody now that's looking at this data together is a research team. Let's talk about what our hypotheses are, what we think what to think we're finding, and then how do we lay out the process to solve that? So you can kind of, I don't know, maybe you can use those points of discrepancy as a way to talk about how you can look at things next with your team.
Yeah. There was interest around reducing friction between PMs and engineers. I thought it was interesting, too. That question was very specific. It wasn't friction between the product team. It was very specific between PMs and engineers. I think that implies that the relationships between PMs and designers are perfect. And that's because designers are how do you reduce friction between PMs and engineers? Cameron?
We have a lot of great PMs who I think check off some of the boxes that we've talked about today, especially in terms of relationship building. I love working with our PMs, at least in events, because I watch them interact and treat every member of the team as an equal contributor to that team. And so it's not just the research, the PM and the design relationship. You know, there's this typical three-legged stool in our industry of the engineering lead or development lead, the PM, and the designer, which is great. But you kind of leave out all of the other people that contribute to that team if you're just focused on those three legs of that stool. And the PMs that at least I work with do an outstanding job of recognizing that everyone on that team is absolutely critical to the work, and they treat engineers with a significant amount of respect. They'll often have one-on-ones with them. They are very much an equal member of that team. So I think, from what I've seen at least, it's a lot of relationship building.
Yeah. Andi?
I would say the best PMs that I know have good relationships with engineers because they pull them in and collaborate with them. Most PMs recognize that they are not engineers. And I think having that humility to build a partnership with your engineering team to say, I know you know this better than I do, and how can we make this product or experience amazing, tends to lead to really good results and make that relationship really solid. Because neither is really going to work well without each other. Engineers don't really want to go into customer homes. They don't want to talk to the salespeople. They don't really want to write requirements. But letting them into that process where they can add a lot of value, I think creates a really respectful relationship that tends to be really productive.
It could be back to the mindset of being more of a facilitator, right? Where you're organizing the operations of people who do their jobs best. You're not the one holding all the answers. You're the one saying, I can learn from you, I can learn from you, I can learn from you. Let's get together.
Exactly.
Yeah, and maybe to add on to that as well, you know, I mentioned early in our industry, it was a development-driven industry. And I think we have to be cautious now because there's a lot of talk about moving towards a design-driven industry. And I think we put other disciplines at risk when we talk that way. I think we need to be careful that it's not a design-driven industry, it's not a data-driven industry, but it's rather an informed industry, right? So it's a design-informed industry, a data-informed industry, an engineering-informed industry. And so recognizing that, you know, those engineers know their specialty far better than us, and allowing to give the breathing room and the space to inform us as their peers to understand how we can work together.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thanks.